Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue covering very good players playing the Caro-Kann, my favorite opening. Today we have Nihal Sarin's Caro-Kann games. Now he's another player who isn't known for the Caro-Kann, but he plays it occasionally. And he's another rising junior whose theoretical novelties we should follow if we play the Caro-Kann. I'm going to show you 4 games. He won all 4. I chose 1 rapid game and 1 blitz game as well. The blitz game against M.V.L, which I'm going to show you at the end, was an absolutely insane attacking game with a lot of great attacking ideas. But to start off with, we're going to look at the game against a lower rated player. Okay, this game was played in the Turkish league. His opponent is rated about 2150. He starts pawn e4 and we get the Karpov Caro-Kann, which is my favorite variation, so knight d7 in this position. The idea is you want to go knight f6 without doubling your f-pawns, either by capturing with the e-pawn or with the g-pawn, and you're going to worry about this bishop later. So the critical way to fight this is to go either bishop d3 or bishop c4 in conjunction with knight g5, and bishop c4 puts pressure on f7 and e6, and bishop d3 prepares to castle queenside and have very strong attacking pieces. In my opinion, bishop d3 and or knight g5 together are the toughest to fight against. Now his opponent played knight f3, which isn't a critical line, but after knight gf6, there's one way to play this position that's kind of annoying, and that's knight f6 and knight e5. And this means that white is going to have a great knight on e5. The best way to play against this is to go bishop e6 and then g6, bishop g7. I've played this several times, had some good results with it. It's very different to the usual Caro-Kann, so if you play the Karpov variation, this is something you have to be prepared for. But his opponent played knight e to g5, and this is a big mistake. The reason this is a mistake is because the knights are in the way of one another. And this is a very thematic mistake white often makes. I've faced it, I've beaten it, I've also failed to beat it, even though I knew that it was a mistake. But here's how you do it. You go h6, and the first thing you notice is that the g5 knight can only go to h3. That's about it. You could try knight e6, but it doesn't work. Knight e6 is just a bad sacrifice. So knight h3. Okay, now don't get tempted to go g5 straight away. There's no need for that. The knights really aren't going anywhere. If white wishes to go knight f4, that's fine with you. That's another waste of tempo. So e6, and that's absolutely correct. This is the best move. g5 is the most commonly played move, but it doesn't lead to the biggest possible advantage. After e6, black is better and the engine agrees. Okay, bishop d3, bishop d6, playing for the f4 square, so bishop f4, trying to fight for the square, and queen c7. Now this again means that the knight is completely stranded unless it wishes to go back to g1 at some point. So in this position, g5 is an actual threat. Okay, so queen d2 fights for the f4 square, and now white would like to go bishop d6, queen d6, and queen f4 or knight f4, so we prevent that, g5. And the bishop is attacked, so a capture is forced, because if you retreat, then g4 wins one of the knights, so bishop takes, queen takes, and now one of the knights has to move again. Playing knight e5 loses a pawn. Pretty simply, we just take. So knight h to g1, and you can see that the opening had gone pretty poorly for white. These pieces are completely useless. The knight on f3 doesn't have a single square. Okay, now how do we punish this? Well, Nihal continues pawn to g4, and that puts the knight on the rim. Okay, so knight h4 is forced, and we simply win a pawn. Queen takes d4. Now, at this point is game over. White blundered in the opening. Black punished it perfectly. Now white castled queenside here, and the very simple double attack queen d5 puts pressure on g2 and a2. What do you do here? I don't know. I would resign personally. If not, then you have to come up with a move, but it's pretty tough to come up with a move. The engine says knight e2 is best. If you go a3, then there's knight c5. You're going to trade off the bishop, play for the e4 square, and again be winning. So f4 played, which doesn't really make much sense in light of queen takes e2. Okay, queen c3, we have to defend mate. And now the simplest move is rook g8, just getting out of the spin, preparing to move the knight, preparing to play knight d5 if necessary. Knight e2, finally developing this knight again, knight d5, queen a3, and of course black has a material advantage to extra pawns, so an endgame is hopeless for white. And the conversion was pretty clean. Knight c5, wants to trade off the bishop, f5, saves the g-pawn, blockades everything. G3, well, g3 actually gives black a target, so h5, h4 is happening, but white needed a square for the knight. Bishop d7, king d2, king f7, safe, getting out of all the pins. Knight c3, rook a d8. You don't mind the trade because that would sort of fix your pawn structure. e6 is a backwards pawn. So taking wouldn't really be good. So knight g2, bishop c8, and we get a bunch of trades into a much simpler winning endgame. And white tried d4, rook d6. This is just hopeless. I'm going to show you how the game ended. He managed to trade off the rooks, and with a single rook, this is the end of the game. Rook d1, c5 played, and white resigned. So the endgame was hopeless for white. No need to look at that. But let's come back to this position. So what you want to do as white here is take, and go knight e5. That's the principled way to play. If you don't want to do it, you can go knight g3, which keeps even more tension in the position. And this now asks a very awkward question. How are you going to develop your bishop? I'm going to show you what I do and what the theoretically approved way is. You start with e6, and then after bishop d3, you go c5. And white is probably going to castle or go c3. You take on d4, knight takes d4, and now bishop c5. And eventually, you're going to be playing for e5 or b6. So for example, knight b3, the bishop retreats. I prefer putting the bishop on e7. Rook e1, castles. You don't do anything before you get your king to safety. Queen f3 prevents b6. And now it's your turn to come up with something again. Usually you exploit this knight on b3 by playing a5 and a4 and so on. So it's going to be tough to develop this bishop. That's the second most popular way to play against the Karpov. You just retreat the knight and say, okay, your bishop is bad. But what white did is just a blunder. Playing knight g5 at this stage just means that your knights have nowhere to go. Knight e5 also doesn't work. If you go knight e5 on the next move, then there's a tactic that works. This queen a5 capture, and you pick the pawn up. So yeah, that's the first game. Not the strongest opponent, but a very thematic mistake. Now we're going to have a look at a game against an actually stronger opponent. Now, this game was played in the FIDE World Cup. It was a rapid game, and Deac is actually stronger than Sarin by about 10 points at this stage. So e4, c6, knight f3, d5. Now bear in mind it's a rapid game, so play isn't going to be perfect, but okay. Knight c3, we have the two knights, and Sarin's ideas against the two knights are what made me want to cover his games. As you may know, I go bishop g4 here. I think bishop g4 is the easiest move to play because it leads to setups where you get rid of your bad bishop, and basically there's no attack for white for the next 5 or 10 moves. It's hard to come up with something. But Sarin takes on e4, the second most popular, and after knight e4 he plays knight f6, which is the main move. Queen e2 is the main move, and now a surprise. Now, the way you play this position is, of course, the simplest. Knight takes, queen takes, knight d7. You want to bring your knight to f6. You want to develop your bishop to f5 or to g4. Very standard stuff. However, Sarin plays knight a6. And this, to me, was a very strange move. This had been played a couple of times before. The idea is to gain control over d5 eventually by playing knight c7. And sometimes, if you can manage to get in e5, which is unlikely, to put the knight on e6. I've seen one idea like this. So what white should do to punish this is, of course, take on f6. And you're forced to take with the g-pawn and then d4. Okay, but the idea behind this could be to go h5. And what you're trying to do is get your bishop to g6, maybe get your other bishop to h6, put the knight somewhere in the center, and say that white isn't castling kingside because the g file is open. This to me seems risky. The engine says it's equal. I would rather like to be white. So this is the way white should play against knight a6. This new idea. Now, I have been studying those positions because I plan to play knight a6 at some point. So I think it's interesting. Okay, white continues c3, which isn't the critical move. Now Nihal Sarin changes his mind and plays knight takes, queen takes. Now, of course, you don't have knight f6 with the tempo on the queen, but you do have queen d5. And since black has the bishop pair, still, black did not trade off the light-squared bishop, and since black still has a pawn on e7, this bishop is free to move. So queen d5 is actually a good move, because if the queen is taken, then this bishop gets a free diagonal, basically. Let's assume that d4 is played. This is a standard Carlsbad where black has zero issues. The bishop is going to develop somewhere, probably to f5, and then you have to do something about the knight. However, if white wishes to take it, that opens up the b file, gives black the bishop pair, and the position is extremely sound. So I don't think the queens should be traded off. So I think correctly, white continues queen e3. The knight comes back, d4 played, necessary, you want to open up your bishop, but now bishop f5. And it seems that black managed to get the perfect Caro-Kann. Not only do you have your bishop on f5, and you're going to be able to play e6 without any consequences, but you actually have control over e4. That's the funniest part. Normally, black doesn't control the e4 square in positions where the d5 pawn has been traded off. Okay, white continues bishop e2, e6, the perfect Caro-Kann. This is the perfect Caro-Kann. Not that black is better, but black has zero issues. That's, if you can get a position with zero issues and no attack for white in the Caro-Kann, that's a success, because all endgames are superior for black because the position is easier to play. You have stuff to undermine, you're controlling the pawn breaks. You can see that white doesn't really have a pawn break unless c4 d5 is played, and black has c5, black has e5, black has ideas of undermining the queen side. Okay, castles, bishop e7. Playing bishop d6 could be kind of awkward because the queen doesn't have a lot of squares, so I agree with that. c4 and now queen e4, why not? I mean, this pawn is now a weakness. d5 is never happening. Okay, so rook d1 played. White would like to repair the pawn structure and defend the d4 pawn. That may not be bad because this bishop, for black I mean, because this bishop controls e4. So taking on e3 I don't think would be a mistake, but Sarin castles. Okay, knight e5 doesn't really threaten anything except for knight d7, which I don't think is such a big deal, but still rook fd8 puts pressure on d4. g4, okay, bishop g6, taking this bishop, I don't know about that, because queen takes and then there's pressure on d4, and why did you play g4? Your pawn is pinned all of a sudden, and I cannot say that I agree with g4. It seems kind of loose. It's not a bad move according to the engine. The position is still about equal, but still. So bishop f3 forces a queen trade, queen e3, fe3 played, defending the d-pawn, and white did manage to achieve a little bit of something, some control over the e4 square, but this bishop is kind of buried, and if you ever play e4, then it seems that d4 is going to become a weakness. Also, if I can take on e5, then you're going to have a dreadful pawn structure. So bishop f6. This now forces a trade. If the knight goes back, then we have c5, e5, c5, and so on. So knight takes g6, h takes, and bishop d2. Now, this bishop could go to c3. It could also go to a5, so we have to be slightly worried about the spin. If the bishop comes to a5, that indirectly fights against e5, which is a pawn break we would desperately like to play at this point as black. So black plays it straight away. The idea is, of course, to just blast through the center, create additional weaknesses, break up the white pawns. If this is taken, then it's basically game over. Weak, 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 weak. The diagonal is weak. Everything's falling apart. The knight has e6, then g5, then maybe even e4 if the bishop moves. Too many weaknesses. So on e5 the pawn cannot be taken. On the other hand, if nothing is done, then black takes the pawn, and that's no good either. So bishop a5. For the moment, distracting black and preventing e takes d. So rook a c8. That was taken, surprisingly, but it allows d5 if white wants to play it, because the knight is a key defender of the d5 square. But we get a very thematic Caro-Kann endgame from this. I've faced c4 d5 as white's only pawn break idea many times. That happens in all Caro-Kann positions where d is played at some point, where black doesn't have the d pawn. And you get this typical e6, c6 pawn formation. The only way for white to make progress is to go d5, but it's extremely risky. Okay, so bishop c7, rook c7, d5. Now, you can react to this many different ways. If you take this, then white gets a passed pawn, or white chooses to take with the bishop and says, okay, I have a perfect bishop on d5, there's pressure on f7, and so on. So what Sarin does is not thematic at all, but it works tactically in this position. Now the engine says, if you play cd5, then bishop d5 should be played. And black should continue e4, which is basically the same idea, it's just that you throw in cd5. He played e4 straight away, and this of course threatens to win a pawn. If you just retreat the bishop, I'm gonna take on d4, or sorry, it doesn't threaten to win a pawn, but it threatens to take on b2, and it also threatens to take on d5 and play rook c2, which would be an overwhelming advantage. So the combination of this bishop opening up and the fact that basically if you take on e4, I can just go rook e8 and regain my pawn, means that black has an easier game to play. Bishop e4 was played, rook e8 was played. You have to retreat your bishop, you cannot go rook d4 because I take it, so bishop f3. Now I'm not sure about bishop f3. I think bishop g2 may have been more precise because it doesn't lose a tempo on the bishop. Okay, but he didn't take on e3 straight away, he played bishop b2. Now I was looking at rook takes e3, but then king f2 gains a tempo on the rook, and you're probably not gonna win the b pawn. So I would have been very tempted to do something like this, rook c2 e7, but now rook a c1, and if you now take on b2, then d6, and this pawn is rolling forward, you cannot go rook d7. So basically this doesn't give black time to take the pawn on b2, so his decision to take on b2 straight away was correct, of course. Okay, rook a b1. The bishop comes to a3, key defender of d6. This is the only source of counterplay white has, and it also prevents c4. If we imagine the bishop coming to this diagonal, then after d6, rook d7, c5 defends the pawn, you'd have to undermine with b6, but that loses the c6 pawn with tempo on the rook. So bishop a3 was actually a key move, and it was made possible because black took on b2. So this is very precise play for a rapid game. Okay, rook b3, bishop c5 prevents d6, c5 once again. Rook d3, okay, and now if I had black, I would definitely consider putting a rook on the d file just to prevent d6, but he played g5, which is an excellent move. And g5 basically prevents the h-pawn from moving. So now, technically, black is a pawn ahead on the king side, because one pawn is controlling two pawns. So g5 is a very thematic idea, and an excellent idea. Okay, king g2, g6 played, giving the king a square, preparing f5, preparing to get a passed pawn, so no waiting. h3 doesn't do anything. King g7, rook bc3, again, doesn't really do anything. I think white was out of ideas. If I had white, I'd have tried to double my rooks on the d file, but unfortunately, since the e3 pawn is hanging, that's not possible. And now we see that opposite colored bishop positions where you have a bunch of heavy pieces on the board always favor the attacker. So Sarin has a dark squared bishop, white does not, so e3 is weak, and there's no way to defend it except with a rook or king. So basically you have a bishop for a rook in this trade-off. A rook is preventing a bishop from doing something, and that's not good. Okay, so Sarin starts pushing f5. Why not? And one of the favorite things about Nihal Sarin's games for me is his ability to navigate endgames in a very simple fashion. He doesn't complicate things. He prevents his opponent from being active and then doesn't waste time. He just does something extremely awkward for his opponent straight away. Now f5 doesn't only allow if gf to control the entire fourth rank, it's also basically making the e3 pawn a backwards pawn. Rook b3 played, again doing nothing. King f6, improving the position, fine. Rook d1, giving up a pawn. I'm not sure about this. I don't think you can take because of d6. So if you end up taking everything, so let's say rook e3, bishop e3, d6, it again becomes slightly awkward to defend. Maybe it works, but I would be scared to do that. Let's see. So if rook e3, bishop e3, maybe not even d6, but dc6, and now after bc6, you can just regain the pawn with rook d6 check. And that's probably gonna end up in a draw. I'm not sure. So against rook d1, he took on d5 first. cd5, and now again, if you take on e3, the pawn is rolling forward, so precisely he plays bishop d6. And this now blockades the pawn, finally. The d pawn isn't going anywhere. The e3 pawn is still weak. Now we have weaknesses around the white king, and if we can get the rook to c2, the king is going to be cut off on the first rank. So rook d2, precise. Rook h7. Maybe we're going to double and take the h3 pawn. You can see how useful it was to have the pawn on g5. This pawn is never moving forward. He played rook h7 first. We could try to go rook h8, same idea. gf5 was played, which I definitely think is a bad move. Repairing black's pawn structure and not really reducing the amount of control at all. Rook f2, rook c7. Again, if the rook moves away from the second rank, the rook is infiltrating on f2 or on c2. Bishop to g4 is kind of a tricky move, but easy to deal with. Rook e5 defends, threatens to take the d5 pawn. And now the final mistake, e4, f4. At this point, I think practically speaking, black has a very easy win. Now let's talk about that. this shows amazing understanding from Nihal Sarin. So white has two connected passed pawns. They are defended after white plays bishop f3. But look at the bishops. White has a light squared bishop, so the e5 square can never be contested unless the rooks break through and control e5 from behind. So that means that this blockade of the bishop on d6 and eventually a king on e5 is going to make these two pawns completely useless. Okay, so white has two connected passed pawns, well defended because the rook cannot take on e4. However, those pawns can never move and the blockade can never be lifted. What does black have? Black has a passed pawn on the b file eventually. Black already has a passed pawn on the f file. So we have pawns on two sides of the board, which is always better than central passed pawns in the endgame. And white's passed pawns are basically a shield that's going to cover the black king from the attack of the white pieces. So strategically, this is over. Okay, rook e8, giving the king the e5 square. That's the blockading square. You have to get the king to e5. Rook b2, doing nothing. King e5, bishop g4, again doing nothing. You don't want to take that pawn. It's going to become very scary if you take. So he defends his rook in advance. So now king e4 is actually playable in some positions. Rook b3. Now king e4 here, I was looking at king takes e4 and I was afraid of rook e2, but it's fine. You can go king d4 here. You don't really have to take on d5, allowing this bishop to activate. So after king d4, I'm not sure if white has any compensation at all. I think he could have taken the pawn. I wasn't sure when I was analyzing this position. It felt slightly uncomfortable to have the king stuck on d4, but it's fine. There are no tricks, and this square is covered. If the king checks on d2, then the king just... If the rook checks on d2, then the king just runs away. And if our king gets to e5 again, then we are safe. And we're threatening to go rook e3. If we go rook e3, that means that our king has shelter again. So the pawn could have been taken. Instead of that, rook c4 played, which is arguably safer. You're just gonna try to take with the rook. However, bishop f5, okay, saves the pawn. But now we see why Nihal Sarin is an excellent endgame player. He didn't take the e4 pawn, even though he could have gone one or two pawns up, because he needed that shelter, and his plan was to occupy the c file. And now, again, if the rook comes to c2, it's going to be game over. You cannot allow black to gain the second rank, because this bishop could well become active either on c5 or on d6. But rook bf3 played, allowing rook c2. And now rook c2, rook c2, rook f2. If you trade rooks, it's going to be a draw. So you cannot trade rooks. So a bit of repetition. Okay. Finally, the rook lands on c4. And now, again, if we trade rooks, opposite colored bishops, even though black has passed pawns on two sides of the board, I think these two pawns are enough counterplay for white to be able to hold. The bishop is going to be holding on to, let's say, the b pawn, and the king is going to keep an eye on the f pawn. But black still has two passed pawns. One over here, one over here. With the rook on the board, that's impossible to hold. b6 first saves the pawn, rook d2, now b5, b4. Okay, taking over the third rank, creating a passed pawn. He couldn't go a4 here because of bishop a4. Cutting the king off another square. If you go to f1, I just take on h3. Now the king is much worse. And now finally, he took the pawn. With a single rook on the board, there really is no pressure. On rook e2, you can even go rook e3. Rook g2, you don't mind the rook trade now. You can actually just take on g2 and then play king takes d5, and it's completely winning. Because there is no more counterplay for white. In this position, he took on g3. F takes g3, king g2, king d5, and white resigned. This cannot be defended because the black king is too close to the c3 square, which means that once the pawn advances to, let's say the king goes to b5, you go a4, then you bring the king back to c3 and you push the pawn, the bishop is going to have to sacrifice itself, and there is no counterplay for white. Of course, if there were still two pawns on e4 and d5, white would have been fine. So I thought this was a very interesting game, starting with knight a6, which is a new idea for me, and then going into this endgame knowing that in this structure, against this structure, white is going to have to go c4 and d5, and then exploiting the weakness on d4, slowly playing for different small advantages was, to me at least, very instructive. I hope you liked the game. Okay, the next game was against Max Warmerdam, and this was played in the Tata Steel Challengers, so this is a classical game. Now, Nihal Sarin was rated about 2600, a bit higher than that, so higher than Max Warmerdam at this point. We have e4, c6, the advanced variation, and he plays c5, the Botvinnik Karls. Now there's a game against a 2150 rated player where Sarin plays the same thing, and white manages to draw the game. That game was also interesting, but I decided not to show it to you. Because it was a draw, I wanted to show you only his wins. You can find that game online. But he plays c5. Now, I chose games where he plays things I don't. So I chose not bishop g4 against the two knights, not bishop f5 against the advance, and I chose the Karpov game because I love the Karpov. Okay, knight f3, knight c6, that's one way to play this. You can also take on c5, dc5 now, e6, very standard stuff, and bishop e3 defending the pawn is probably the key variation. Okay, now in this position black plays a seemingly risky move, knight h6. This knight should not be taken because you no longer have defense over c5, and you give up the bishop pair, and the knight is of course coming to f5 in the future. Okay, c3. C3 controls d4. Maybe prepares b4 if black isn't careful. Knight f5. Okay, queen d2. This is all still very standard stuff. Bishop d7 and knight a3. Now knight a3 is one of the choices white has. I prefer bishop e2 for white in this position. I actually had white here before. Bishop e2 or bishop d3. I think bishop e2 is more straightforward. I'm not sure you're threatening to take that knight, or I'm not sure you should take that knight. So maybe not bishop d3, but moving the bishop definitely. Now knight a3 aims to control the d4 square some more, but there's a problem with it. Black goes knight takes e3, and after queen takes e3, black goes b6. This is a variation which tries to refute the move knight a3. If you move the knight to c2 now, then bishop takes c5 and you're down a pawn, or even b takes c5. So you have to play cb6. But after cb6, bishop a3 develops the bishop, prepares to castle in a single move, gains the tempo basically because white played knight a3. Now you don't take the bishop because you lose the b pawn, you throw in b7 and rook b8, and after b8-3 rook takes b7, and this is, I would say, a great setup for black. What we have is a ruined pawn structure for white on the queen side. In compensation for that, black has a bad bishop on d7, and white has a ton of space because of this e5 pawn. But we're going to learn to play around it, and eventually we would like to occupy the b file and put pressure on those weaknesses. So let me show you what happened. Bishop a6, rook b2, jumping in straight away, white castles, and now queen b6. If you trade queens, then I think the endgame is winning for black, because you don't have enough counterplay and you don't have enough defense of e5, so your knight is pretty much tied down. So queen c1, declining, castles, and now we are ready to go rook fb8. After bishop d3, there really is no attack. He's trying to control the b1 square. Knight g5, you can just go h6. This bishop doesn't really threaten anything. h6, preventing knight g5 in advance. c4, good idea, breaking open the center. And this is the part of the game where if I had black, I would panic and I wouldn't know what to do. Whenever my opponent plays c4 in the advance and I don't have a c-pawn which can defend d5, I immediately start thinking that I'm worse if I allow cd5, ed5. Now, that's not true. If you can get enough counterplay to compensate for that weakness and for the possibility of the e-pawn moving forward, you're fine. So he played rook b8, cd5, ed5 was played, rook b1 played, and he just exchanged stuff off. Rook takes. Of course, if queen takes, then again the endgame is better for black because of these two pawns. So bishop takes, and now he plays bishop g4. Bishop g4 is a very interesting move. You're trying to fight against the control over the d4 square by white, and you're trying to undermine the e-pawn. So if knight d4, for example, we go knight e5. If queen d1, we take the knight, we take on e5. So by initiating these trades on b1, Nihal Sarin managed to basically weaken the e5 pawn. And now you see the problem with the queen moving away from e5. Sarin plays queen c2, we have to defend. We don't want to allow queen h7, so g6. Also preparing bishop f5 in some positions. Okay, and now it's white's turn to find counterplay again. White firstly has to defend the pawn, but rook e1 not only defends the pawn, but also maybe there could be some ideas of e6 later on. And if e6, then queen g6 is just deadly, leading to mate, probably. Okay, bishop f3. We don't have time for e6 now because of bishop e4, so we have to take. Gf3 and now knight e5. No more e-pawn. This is a blunder, I think, by white. I don't see how he could have missed this. This was a classical game. It's move 24. I doubt he was in time trouble. Of course, if you take the knight, then I take the bishop. If you don't take the knight, then I'm just a pawn up and you no longer have an e-pawn, and I'm gonna take on f3. So the knight was taken. And a trade. Queen takes, rook takes. Okay, king g2. We have a rook endgame where white has two weaknesses which are very hard to defend, and black has two weaknesses which are very easy to defend. White also has doubled pawns on the f-file. Now, what we need to understand is that if these four pawns were traded off, it would be an easy draw. So black doesn't want to trade pawns. Also, if black manages to trade off these two pawns for the d-pawn, with the black rook being in front of the a-pawn, white has excellent drawing chances. So for example, if I'll just put something on the board, this loses rook, I just want to show you something. So if you get a position like this, okay, this could be easy to hold, because the white king could simply do something like this. Just wait on these two squares and eventually there will be no progress to be made. And if the black king tries to approach, then we can check it away. As soon as the black king reaches, let's say b2, we start checking it away. Okay, the engine says minus 0.2. Okay, so I'm actually correct. There is no way to win this. So that's something you need to know about this endgame. And if I had black, I'd be worried about giving up this pawn for these two. Okay, if we get the same type of position like this one, but the rooks are reversed, like the black rook is on a7 and the white rook is on a2, then it's completely winning, because the white rook, whenever it moves, it gives away more and more and more space, and the black rook is active. If the black rook is passive on a2, then the black rook has no scope. That's why it's a draw. Okay, white played rook e3. The position is very hard to play, so that's an understandable move. King g7, bringing the king closer, rook b3. If we trade rooks, white would have a passed pawn on the b file, which is a flank pawn. And in the endgame, the closer your pawn is to the center, the easier it becomes for your opponent to control the pawn. So if you give white a passed pawn on the b file and black has a passed pawn on the d file, that's an easy draw for white, because the king would be able to control the d pawn. It's already within the square. And the black king would have to get all the way over there to control the b pawn. So we decline, rook a5. Okay, f4, giving the king away in, but giving away some squares as well. Now the black king could go to g4 or e4. King f6, king f3, king f5, rook d3. And now again, we don't want to go into this trade. If we allow these two pawns to be traded off, it may be a draw. So he plays d4, which to me was an incredible move. The idea behind this is that the king is too far away, and you're actually about to lose the f-pawn if we go into similar lines. Like if the white king has to stay on these two squares in the type of position I showed you. However, if this is taken now and then this is taken, the king has to move back. We take on a2, and it's not the same story at all, because the rook is tied down to the defense of f4. So this position, the engine says minus 0.7. I'm not sure the engine wins this, but probably there are far better winning chances for black, because this is a weakness. And of course, if the f-pawn falls, then it's game over. So on d3, white didn't take. On d4, sorry, he played h3. Now rook a4 defends the pawn, rook b3 doesn't do anything, basically. a6, rook d3, rook c4, rook d2, and h5. And if we can get the same type of position, again, with our pawns advancing, if our pawn is on h4 and we're threatening to win the f-pawn, then the same variations work. Unfortunately, there's rook c3 in this position, and white can just achieve that, black can just achieve that. So he plays h4, white plays h4, black plays rook c3. And now, of course, rook d3 loses a rook. You have to move the king back somewhere. And now the final move of the game, you can pause the video here and play the most precise move. Not taking, but king e4, and that's it. There's no defense to c3, there's no defense to f4, there's no defense to h4. The king is too active, and white's position falls apart. So another excellent endgame by Nihal Sarin, and this idea of knight a3 in the c5 advance variation, that's the way to punish it. You go b6 at a good moment, so you take on e3, queen takes c3, and b6. And again, the pawn has to be taken. b4 isn't good. b4 just ruins the pawn structure. We can just go queen a5 here, and that should be it. Okay, the final game I would like to show you is insane, but it was a blitz game, so you're gonna have to forgive the player's mistakes throughout the game. This is the complete opposite of what Nihal Sarin usually does. He went for a crazy attack here. Okay, so c6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, two knights again. d4 again, knight e4, knight f6. Queen e2, same thing. And in this position, if you remember a similar position to this one, he played that idea with knight a6. In this position, he played bishop f5, threatening to win the knight. Now, if you take on f6, you open up both bishops, and black's position is very active, so d3. e6, knight f6, g f6. And this pawn structure with the bishop outside of the pawn chain is actually very safe for black, because you can always put the bishop back on g6, and if it's taken by the knight, you take with the h pawn, and your king is very, very safe. If you get a pawn structure like this, doubled f pawns with g and e, it's very hard to break through, and your rook is active down the h file. That being said, this is a very risky way to play, and I think he wouldn't have done this had this been a classical game. Okay, g3, good idea since the queen is on e2, not easy to develop your bishop. Knight d7, bishop g2, queen c7. Now queen c7 is a mistake, and it could have been punished by knight h4. Then again, it's hard to suggest a move. Probably bishop d6 instead of queen c7. In this position, M.V.L played knight d4. He should have gone knight h4, I think. And on bishop g6, just castles. And you don't have to take straight away. But you improved your bishop. You're going to go bishop f4 maybe. And if the pawn advances, you've given up the f5 square. So it doesn't seem pleasant. It doesn't seem pleasant. If we imagined a black pawn on e5, then maybe even bishop e4 and knight f5, and the knight is just coming in. But he played knight d4, and still bishop g6, castles, castles, queen side. Okay, bishop e3. Now, how would you compensate for the ruined pawn structure, and how would you play with this open g file? Well, you have to attack, and whenever your opponent fianchettos, that gives you a hook, that gives you something to put pressure on, and it basically prevents your opponent from keeping all the files closed. So this is the plan. h5, h4, either h3 or takes. Start opening up the position. I should say that white is much better here. The engine hates the way black is playing, but it's interesting. h5, b4, knight e5, b5. Okay, b5 was slightly premature because we can keep the position closed. Of course, black doesn't want to take, so c5. And now the knight has to move. The b file remains closed for the moment, but b6 is very scary. If b6 happens, the queen is on c7, so it's actually a tempo. What we would like to do is be able to close the position down with a6 after b6, but as long as the queen remains on c7, that's not going to be possible. Which means that b6 is going to open up one of the files by force. Knight b3, h4, just continuing. Now, if I had black here, I would seriously consider moving my queen away, but that's not easy to do because you lose the c-pawn. You cannot go queen d6 because of bishop c5. You don't want to go b6, preventing b6 because of a4, a5. So h4. Okay, a4. Now what's going to happen is this, and the files are going to open up. So this is an extremely double-edged position. Now a4 is a big mistake according to the engine. M.V.L should have gone f4 according to the engine again, where black probably has to play bishop h5. The queen drops back to e1, the knight goes to g4. It's complicated, but you're quicker in the attack, I think, because the two bishops are defending the king. After a4, black actually had a chance to be much better here. This is the key position. Sarin didn't find the correct move. He played h takes g3, against which M.V.L blundered and transposed to the same key position Sarin should have gone for in the first place. The correct move was bishop h5, and as we can see here, f3 is the only way to defend. If the queen moves away, then we just have knight f3. And for example, queen e1, knight f3, this cannot be defended against. There's just no way. You're never going to be covering the light squares. I could take, or I could simply go queen d7 and d5, and that's it. You're getting mated. If you go knight d2, I can probably retreat my bishop somewhere and continue to slowly open the position up. Okay, instead he played h takes g3. Now, M.V.L played h takes, which is a big mistake, again forcing f3. he should have gone f takes, which is a very hard move to play, because now on bishop h5, queen e1, you have an extra defender of the f3 square, so that makes way more sense. The way this happened in the game after h takes g3 is just a transposition to the other line. So bishop h5, f3 is forced, and now bishop d6, and doesn't seem easy to play for white. The other rook is going to come to g8. There are going to be two rooks lined up on the h and g files. There's a battery over here. There's pressure on f3. White's attack didn't really happen yet. You still have to go a5, b6. So white at least needs two more moves to start the attack. Knight d2, bringing a piece to the defense. That's fine. Rook dg8, pressure on g3. Knight e4 defense threatens to take on f6. So bishop e7 seems forcing. Finally a5, and now f5. Okay, f5 removes the defender of g3, but now it gets extremely sharp. b6. Now you can see why black would wish that the queen wasn't on c7. If the queen was anywhere else, we could just answer this with a6, but unfortunately in this position we have to take, because if we don't take, then ba7 and queening happens. Once this happens, a takes b6, you don't want to take the pawn because of rook b1. And if you move your queen away, then there are mating threats on a8 for the rest of the game. Okay, so your king is only going to have the d7 square, and if the d file opens up, that's going to be checkmate. So white should aim to play d4 as soon as possible. Okay, white plays bishop f4. Bishop f4 is, from a human perspective, a very nice move because it threatens to take away some more squares from the black king, prevents king b8. But knight d2 was more precise. After knight d2, what you would like to do is eventually open up this bishop. And if we go f4, then I don't know who that benefits more. Probably white. The queen moves and then there's pressure over here. So the engine says white is actually better here. Black should play king d7 and then white just goes queen f2 and is ready to go f4. At this point the engine plays either queen c8 or queen takes b6. I would be scared to play both moves. Okay, but bishop f4 played instead is fine. Queen d5 defends the knight. And this position is white to play and win. Okay, Nihal Sarin made a huge mistake. You can pause the video here and try to figure out what to do. This is an extremely instructive attacking position. Okay, so the winning idea is pretty hard to see, in my opinion. M.V.L played d4, which is a human move that makes a ton of sense. And Nihal Sarin actually ended up blundering against this. What he should have done against d4 was bishop f3, which gains the tempo on the queen. You basically have to take, and then knight f3 saves the knight, and after queen f3 you just play fe4. And I don't see how white plans to break through. If you move your queen, which you are gonna do, then I could probably just go c4, making sure that the d file never opens. Okay, what should have been done instead of d4 was c4. c4 was the winning idea. Now, what do we have here? The queen is attacked, and we cannot go knight d3 because of pawn takes queen. We cannot go queen d7 because of rook a8. We cannot go queen d8 because of rook a8. So we have two options, either queen d4 or queen d3. Queen d3 loses immediately, just rook f to d1, and that's it. You cannot take the queen because you get mated. Again, this pawn on b6 means that black's king is in trouble. Queen e2, rook a8 mate. That's the end of the game. And if you take the rook, I just take with the queen, and you again get mated. There's no salvation. You cannot prevent this. On c4, if you play queen d4 check, then bishop e3. And it's the same sort of thing. Queen takes d3, rook f d1. Game over. That's it. So c4 was immediately winning, and I didn't see it straight away. It took me about 10 minutes to find the idea of c4, and then it took me about a minute to calculate because it's very straightforward. I think it's hard to see, not hard to calculate. Okay, but he played d4, and as I said, bishop f3 should have been played. Instead, knight c6 was played. And now white is fine again. The position is about equal. Okay, knight takes c5 was played, queen takes d4 was played, bishop e3 was played. Now again, you can pause the video here. I'm going to spoil the position by saying that it's equal with correct play. However, it's not a good kind of equal for white. This is black to play and try to trick white. What would you play here if you had the black pieces? Okay, there's only one correct move, and what you have to do to see it is understand that there's pressure on both files. The king is cut off from h2, and this diagonal in conjunction with the h file could lead to mating attacks. So what we do here is bishop takes c5. Okay, now we're threatening to win the bishop, and if, for example, if bishop takes d4, the most straightforward move, then bishop takes d4, your only move is rook f2, and after rook f2 we just take on a1. That's it. Again, you cannot move your rook because I'm gonna go bishop d4, so you probably have to play c3 and then bishop c3, and then again you probably have to play king f1, give up the exchange. This is way too much material for black. So on bishop takes d4, black wins. You cannot take the queen. What are the alternatives? Okay, M.V.L did end up playing bishop takes d4. There's no way to defend the bishop, at least not comfortably. A good move was rook a8. After rook a8, white actually has a draw and an equal position. Now again, this was a blitz game, so very hard to see all of this. King d7 is forced, and now rook d1. And now the queen cannot take the bishop. Okay, you have to take on a8. After you take on a8, bishop takes on d4. Bishop takes d4 check. Rook d4, knight d4, and we save our queen. Queen d1. We also prepare to pick this knight up. The only way to defend is rook a4. And this should be relatively balanced. Of course, black is technically a piece ahead. The engine finds a way to draw, although for a human, I'm not sure anybody would be able to draw this, at least not easily. But okay. The way it was played out in the game, bishop takes d4. Now, bishop takes d4 is of course correct. And I showed you the variation with rook f2, bishop a1, and so on. Nihal Sarin played knight d4, and now M.V.L could have drawn again. The best move again to draw is rook a8, which he did play, king d7, and in this position he played queen d3, losing immediately. He should have just gone rook d1. There are no discovered checks by the knight, because the knight cannot move. So black picks up the rook, white goes c3, gonna win the knight. Rook a1 is probably the best move, getting rid of the pin. You cannot take because of knight takes queen. But now queen d3 just defends the rook, and we get the same sort of position again, where white may be able to hold. But M.V.L played queen d3, and this now really is game over. We just take on a8, c3, rook a3, you cannot take the knight, g4, king e7. Actually, there was a better move. He could have taken on c3 because the rook cannot be taken, knight e2. But king e7 is fine. Gh5, knight e2 check. If you take the knight, you cannot take the knight because of the discovered check. So you have to move down to the h file. Rook takes. Bishop h3 was played, and rook h3 was the final move of the game. If king h3, then knight f4. So even though there were a ton of blunders in this game, it was just a blitz game, so that's understandable. What I like is the idea of doing this, allowing g takes f, and then playing for the attack with h5, h4, and so on. I like this idea. Okay, I hope you liked Nihal Sarin's games. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. Let me know what you think. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.